Welcome, everyone, to this introduction to our podcast edition of Listening to America. My conversation with Lindsay Chervinsky about her splendid new book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. Oxford University Press. Lindsay is becoming one of the most important intellectuals of the early national period, a presidential historian. You're going to see her on media for decades. This is an even better book than her first one, which I liked. This is how I met her, through the first book, The Cabinet. Now this book is sort of about the presidency of John Adams, and in many respects not. It's really about America's norms and constitutional systems, the transfer of power, free and fair elections, what one administration owes to its predecessor and to its successor, about how the Constitution was mostly silent on these questions. And so George Washington had to kind of make it up as he went along. Should I have a cabinet? If so, what's their function? Should I call on friends and strangers? Should I have dinner parties? How should I address people? How should they address me? Should I even go to my successor's inauguration? Is that rude? Is that taking the limelight away from him? Do you consult the cabinet on all occasions, or are they advisory? And so on. I mean, all these things are silent in the U.S. Constitution. And Washington did a lot of it. He laid down the norms, the small c constitutional norms, beautifully. I mean, probably nobody could have done it better. Nobody, not even Jefferson. And then Adams, who had never once been invited to a cabinet meeting. He had never seen how a cabinet meeting works in the United States. And again, they're not in the Constitution. So now he's completely bewildered by what's the proper procedure. And he, unfortunately, he kept the cabinet that Washington left, including the evil Timothy Pickering. And the cabinet was loyal to Hamilton, even more loyal to Hamilton than to George Washington, who was now home at Mount Vernon. And the cabinet of Adams undermined him in every possible way. They were terrible people, mediocre, but also evil. I mean, deliberately undermining the duly elected president of the United States and working behind his back and backbiting and whining to Washington and whining to Hamilton and working with Hamilton, who was kind of the shadow president from New York. Adams was a very shrewd man. He sensed all of this, and he later learned unmistakably what they were doing and got rid of them. But he, meanwhile, somehow maneuvered through the Quasi-War, the undeclared naval war we had with France, which could have been a disaster for everybody. Unclear that the United States could really fight that war in 1798. He steered his way through it. When his party, the Federalists, wanted war. They wanted war, who knows why. Hamilton wanted war because war was glory. War was how he was going to build his legacy, and he wanted to lead an army against France and maybe against the Spanish, Central and South American Empire, and maybe against his enemies, his Jeffersonian enemies in Virginia and the South. So for Hamilton, it was mostly personal, although not without policy considerations. For the other Federalists, some of it was merely political. This is a way to damage the Jeffersonian republics. And one of the things you learn from her book is that we were just as vicious then, as partisan, as bickering, as deliberately misinterpreting, mischaracterizing others, secret attacks, open attacks. It was a vicious Machiavellian time. And so when we think, we're in an unprecedentedly bad time, we're just not telling the truth. A point that David Swenson always used to make, and he was right, of course. So that's one of the takeaways from this splendid book. The greatest takeaway, and you'll hear us talk about it, is that we know how it came out, so we assume it had to come out that way. But it didn't have to come out that way, and we're very, 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 very lucky that it came out the way that it did, and it owes a great deal to the vilified and underestimated second president of the United States, Mr. John Adams. I've had the chance since The Cabinet was published a few years ago, Lindsay's first book, to watch her career, and it is amazing to watch, and I'm just so thrilled, deeply thrilled to have the chance to work with her, and she was absolutely at her best today, and we had a great talk. And even though she, in her book, says a very large number of very unpleasant things about Mr. Thomas Jefferson, that's for later. I wanted this one to be fully celebratory and secret. My quibbles about Jefferson are really, on the whole, very tiny. She got it right. And, of course, I'm no 100% Jefferson partisan. I know when he failed. And, of course, there's the great issue of slavery, but there are many others. In fact, I just did the trial of Thomas Jefferson, which you should bring to your own public radio station as a fundraiser. I've done it at the Roper Theater in downtown Norfolk. I just did it in Vail. The trial of Thomas Jefferson. My friend Jason Kipros of Norfolk is the prosecutor. He's hilarious. He's a stand-up comic, among many other things, and a playwright and a screenwriter. We've had the greatest time. We want to do it all over the country. it's not only entertaining and interesting, but it's important because there are 4 counts in the indictment. Number 1, Jefferson liked to screw his political enemies, as Richard Nixon put it, and Jason uses that language, to which Mr. Jefferson blushes. Number 2, that Jefferson dispossessed and displaced Native Americans, and not always in a fully honorable way. It's certainly a critically important issue in our time. Number 3, Jefferson had weirdly retro views of women and said ridiculous things about the tender breasts of ladies and our American angels and the nursery and so on. And then number 4, of course, slavery. And then at the end, after Jefferson is skewered, and we don't play it for laughs, but there's plenty of humor in all of this, except on the question of slavery, of course. It's a great program, and I'd love to carry it across the country, and Jason is ready to do it too. So anyway, Lindsay Chervinsky, all hail Lindsay Chervinsky. What a great achievement. This is the making moment now of her career as a major American historian and presidential historian. Enjoy it, folks. Let me know what you think. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this really special edition of Listening to America, because Lindsay Chervinsky's book is out. I've read it. I've got dozens and dozens of pages of notes. I've been snorting steam through my ears. I've been wanting to wrestle on national television. But mostly, I just want to say that Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic, is an outstanding book. I think even better than your first book, The Cabinet. But I love The Cabinet too.
I'm glad that it's better. I want it to be better. I feel that I am a better writer, and I feel that I have learned my craft. And I think I also was paying more attention to craft with this book. So I'm glad that it comes across that way.
Yes. And I want to believe that it's so much better because I've been your mentor and friend, but of course it has nothing whatsoever to do with it. All right. So I want to make 3 points right away. One is the partisanship and viciousness and Machiavellian politics of this era. It's really common in our time, Lindsay, to say, oh, we're in this unprecedented, we should never, look at all the disputes and the backbiting and no, nothing is new under the sun. This was an incredibly partisan, even vicious political era. That's number 1. And number 2, I think you wrote this book partly in the shadow of the political troubles of our time. I hear you commenting on where we are. I can hear your own observation and even anxiety about the era that we live in. And I think that you wrote a number of key passages in this book to say, this is how it's supposed to be, without ever mentioning the word Trump or MAGA or anything else. Number 3, what you said on a previous program really has struck me again. We look at all of this as if it were bound to happen. We look in hindsight as if, of course, it was going to come out this way. But 2 things really struck me, Lindsay. Number 1, the fragility of our republic. I mean, that's really a central theme of your book, that, we all think, well, they muddled through and it got stronger and stronger. But the fragility that many well-meaning people of both sides, and nonpartisans too, wondered whether this republic could even survive the first transfer of power, even if it's a happy transfer of power between George Washington and John Adams. So that really struck me. The second thing about that, the hindsight paradox, is that the vulnerability of the United States at this time. I mean, almost everybody felt we might not survive getting sucked into the war between Britain and France. We might not survive a war of any sort at this juncture in our history. And again, I knew that, but you've really emphasized that. So, and first of all, do you think that's a fair set of propositions?
Well, I am nearly in tears because that is so perfectly and exactly what I wanted people to take away. And I didn't tell you in advance to say that because I wanted this book to stand the test of time so that it wouldn't feel like it was written at a particular moment, but for people who are living in this particular moment. I wanted them to feel the parallels if it struck them without me banging them over the head about it. If anything, I think writing this book made me more patriotic and more devoutly protective of our institutions and so committed to their survival with recognition that that is a hard thing to do. And so I'm just deeply touched that you carefully read it and took away those things, and I have so much gratitude for that.
Well, let me just say, I wish I could just replay the tape where you said that wild thing that, like, I nailed it, that I got it, I read it perfectly.
You did, you nailed it.
I'm your
A+.
ideal reader.
Excellent reading comprehension.
Are you listening, America? Are you listening, America? That we may squabble over politics and history, but I got it. And so let's go back to the beginning. Again, your view that it's always a mistake to think that it came out the way that it did because it had to come out the way that it did. That history is a series of contingencies that it's very hard for us to sort out. And we have to get out of the mindset that it was all going to be okay if we want to try to understand, right? Okay, so number one, the partisanship. Oh my goodness. I mean, I knew all this, of course, but one party ginning up war fever, in part to mess with the other party. I mean, in part, they were using this to club each other all the time. And that deeply offends me, Lindsay, to think that, you know, that this idealistic new republic, this new thing under the sun, as Mr. Jefferson put it, was behaving just the way nations have always behaved, and cynicism and putting narrow temporary partisan victories over the long-term health of their republic. You must have thought about that all the time, right?
Well, I did, but it's so funny that response to me indicates like your deeply Jeffersonian perspective.
Yeah.
Because if you expect the world to be behaving better, then you're going to be disappointed. If you expect that we have always been slightly ridiculous and very partisan and personally motivated and, you know, a more Adams perspective, if you will, you are not all that surprised. And to me, that's actually in some ways kind of comforting, because we were acting utterly ridiculous and terrible, and yet we still got through it. And so today, to me, that's more comforting, that we can be utterly ridiculous and terrible and still find a way to get through it.
All right, so now we slightly disagree, because I don't think I was being Jeffersonian there. I think I was being small r early American Republican. Don't you think that even Hamilton, even the Pickering, who's I think the evil one in your book? I can't wait to come back to that. But I think if you hate anyone in this book, you hate Timothy Pickering.
Yeah, I usually try and hide my hatred, but on that one, I kind of let it rip. I let it rip in this one.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna quote you back at yourself here shortly. But I love that, because I could just tell. I bet when you wrote that, you thought, you know, a historian really needs to withhold judgment and stand back and just, you know, but you couldn't do it because he's so evil. He's just such a horrible, horrible, horrible human being. All right. So also the fragility of the republic. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, you know, I think republics are always to a certain extent fragile because they require so much participation and civilian buy-in in order to continue to work. Whereas a monarchy is all you really need is a whole lot of force, and you need to have a hereditary line. You need a whole lot less buy-in. I just think that republics are always this fragile thing because of the nature of what they are, but especially at the beginning, because building something is so incredibly hard. Tearing it down is easy. And building something that has emotional significance, you and I have talked a lot about when the Constitution kind of became a thing that people revered and cherished, and it took a really long time. And what I think is so important about the founding era and the Adams presidency is that they knew that it was going to be really hard and it was going to take a really long time. And that's why they were so worried about the fragility, is because they knew they hadn't gone through those decades and decades and decades of experiences. And so all of these institutions, all of these experiences, all of these practices and the offices, they were still so new and fresh, and therefore really easy to throw out.
I'm talking with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky about her splendid new book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. You know, I've always thought that the answer to the Quasi-War was John Adams eventually saying an undeclared naval war with France. A very serious crisis, actually, more than I think I've ever understood until I read your book. But I've always sort of concluded with John Adams when he says, there really isn't a chance in the world that France is going to send troops over to the United States. You know, we got to calm down now. We got a little caught up in this, and now let's figure this out. These people on both sides were really, really, really worried that our republic might not be able to survive the world political situation in spite of the 3,000-mile moat between us and Europe. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're right that Adams does ultimately conclude that France just really isn't going to invade, but that's partially because Britain continues to have more success in their conflicts. So Britain and France had been at war at this point off and on since 1793 and continued to be so for many years and many years prior, and they basically were off and on for multiple centuries. But at any given moment, France really had the upper hand, and at this point, Napoleon was coming into power. So France appeared to be climbing towards its apex of power and influence and did have the largest army in the world. And while Adams eventually concluded it was very unlikely they were going to send that army across the Atlantic Ocean, you just never really know. And you never really know what is going to happen, especially if you don't have much of a navy or an army to defend yourself, which at the beginning of this crisis and the Adams presidency, the United States did not. And even if you do have a navy and an army, warfare at this period, although I would really argue warfare at any period, is unpredictable. And, at this period, when you have a navy, if you have a bad storm, it can go down pretty fast. And so there's just no way to guarantee that a war, even if the odds are stacked in your favor, is ever going to be winnable. And as a new nation, that is a pretty big risk to take. And so I think those were the stakes that people had in mind.
So I felt the shadow of the last 10 years especially. It's a very dangerous moment in the history of a republic. As a historian, you're certainly 100% aware of that. You wrote the book, and I can hear echoes of peaceful transfer and free and fair elections and graciousness and norms. So you had to have a strategy of that, because you don't want to say Mitt Romney put a dog on the top of his car, because that's over, and that comes, that goes. You want your book to be evergreen. Yeah. You want it to be read 40 years from now, and people not saying, "Oh, well, she wrote it because she was concerned about the crisis." So how did you strategize and navigate that? Yeah,
so I think that my goal was to focus on what I kind of consider to be the everlasting, or hopefully everlasting, principles, which are those things, the peaceful transfer of power, elections, the importance of elections and the vote, and civilian control over the military, and what the transition looks like, and the presidency and executive power. And there were moments when I thought of, as I am trying to describe something, how would I describe it if I was talking about it today? And I wrote it that way, but then took out the language about today, and I put in, where appropriate, the description that I was talking about at the moment. So, for example, when this is most prevalent for me was in the May 9th, 1798 mob outside the president's house. And when I hear them talk about cockades, it's how I think we talk about red hats.
A cockade is a little insignia. It's a symbol. It's
a fabric floret, basically, and depending on what color you wore, it indicated your political status. And by 1798, if you were wearing the red, white, and blue cockade, it meant you were a Democratic Republican. It meant you were pro-France. And if you were wearing the black and white one or the black one, it meant you were a Federalist and you were more pro-Britain. And I was thinking about how, when you see them describing what it meant to see the red, white, and blue, the flashes of the red, I was like, that is how we often describe the flashes of seeing a red MAGA hat. And so I was thinking about, how would I describe that if I didn't mention a MAGA hat or a pink hat, and I instead described the cockade. And so I wanted it to feel relevant without me saying, here's the parallel you should be drawing, because that seemed to me to be totally unnecessary. Because if you don't want to think about contemporary politics, you don't have to. You can read it entirely as an 18th century book, with the exception of, I do mention January 6th and its importance to me in thinking about these things.
We need to take a break. I'm talking with Lindsay Chervinsky about her spectacular second book, Making the Presidency. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. Lindsay Chervinsky is with me. I believe you are at Mount Vernon today.
I am. I'm at my office at the George Washington Presidential Library, where I have my replica key that the Marquis de Lafayette sent to George Washington.
That was a replica?
Yeah.
I love to see that. So the Bastille goes down on the 14th of July, and Lafayette, who was so caught up in the idea that France was going to follow us and form a peaceful Republican culture after centuries of terrible abuse, And so he gets the key to the Bastille to George Washington. Do you have any sense of how Washington responded to that?
Yes, I mean, he wrote back. I should be able to quote the letter. There are a lot of things I need to memorize. That's one of them. But he was really touched by it. He was really honored by it, because at that point, initially, they did think that France was going to be the, sister revolution and the sister in spirit to this same idea. And it wasn't until later that the revolution became a much scarier version of what they were trying to achieve. And so initially he was incredibly touched by this gesture, and he hung it in his entrance hall at Mount Vernon, and it stayed there his entire life. So it really was like a centerpiece for anyone who came in. So he wouldn't have done that if he didn't care so much about it.
He didn't put it in the closet during the terror?
It's not one of those things that you drag out when your mother-in-law comes to visit. No, this was on central display for everyone to see. And as you know, there was a period of time after his presidency where I think, in a couple year span, he and Martha only had a couple of dinners where they didn't have guests in 3 years, because it was both the expectation of hosting and social custom in Virginia and travel, but that was and people wanted to come see him. He was an object of curiosity. And so everyone who came in saw the Bastille key.
I want to talk about 3 episodes in your book that I just loved and were actually really funny or really moving to me. The 4th thing I would have said about what we need to remember is the obsession with honor in this period. Because we don't have any in our time. Ted Cruz can hear that his wife is ugly, and his father helped to assassinate John Kennedy, and he comes right back. And J.D. Vance called the former president America's potential Hitler. Now he's his vice president. We can't understand this period, can we, unless we have a real sense of how deeply honor mattered and how prickly certain people were. I'm reading Alexander Hamilton here. How prickly certain people were about that honor, but they all felt it.
They did, and I think part of it is the social custom at the time that the way you operated in society was based on your personal reputation. So that was your economic credit. You didn't have a credit number, you had a reputation. You didn't have a social security number, you had a reputation. And it dictated your marriage market, it dictated your economic opportunities, your ability to purchase real estate, everything. So I get, on one hand, why they really cared, because it did have real impact on your life. But it also was, sort of what we might, to use very modern language, there was sometimes an element of toxic masculinity to it, where it was people were obsessed with this sense of honor and being a man of honor. And I think some of the values were actually quite good and upstanding, and there are times when it really did lead people to do the right thing. But then there are times when it caused them to be so obsessed about protecting their honor that they got into duels, for example, or published absurd pamphlets.
There are dozens of affairs of honor for everything that winds up as a duel for men. And I just want to look at one. So everyone knows that Hamilton got seduced by Maria Reynolds and had this tawdry affair with her, and then was blackmailed by her husband. And then he was accused of public corruption of funds. So he had a meeting. He called in Monroe and a man named Venable and another named Muhlenberg, and they came to him and said, you got to tell us what's going on here. And Hamilton said, look, I'm perfectly honest and virtuous publicly. You shouldn't worry about that, I can assure you. But I did have this tawdry affair, and that's what this is really about, and I regret it. And they said, fair enough, we're gentlemen. We're gentlemen of honor. We'll keep this secret. We'll seal this file. So then a number of years later, it leaks. And Hamilton immediately decides it's Monroe. And in just a word, that's probably true, isn't it?
Yeah, so evidence suggests that Monroe probably kept those documents that had the proof with Jefferson, and they probably decided to leak them. But it was almost certainly Monroe's fault. Whether it was his final decision to leak them or whatnot, it was almost certainly his fault.
May have involved John Beckley and others, but Monroe was the funnel through which this had to have come, and so I think Hamilton rightly understood that. So he demands a meeting with Monroe on July 11, 1797, on Wall Street, and I just want to read from your dialogue here. Then I'm just quoting Lindsay now. Leaping to his feet, Hamilton declared to Monroe, "Your representation is totally false." Monroe: "Do you say I represented falsely? You are a scoundrel." He rises to his feet. Hamilton: "I will meet you like a gentleman." Hamilton hotly replied. Monroe snapped, "I am ready. Get your pistols." Hamilton: "It will not be settled in any other way." And then their seconds jump in and pull them apart like boxers and say, let's talk this thing through. And they eventually manage to talk it down. But I mean, when I read that, Lindsay, I didn't think toxic masculinity. I thought infantile masculinity. These two guys, like, squaring off and shouting ridiculous epithets at each other. You scoundrel, I shall meet you.
Well, first of all, I'm so glad that you read that. I had so much fun reading that out loud when I was narrating the book. It was just absolutely just so much fun. Yeah, I mean, they're hotheads. They're total hotheads, and it's when later Hamilton accuses Adams of being a hothead, it's an awful lot of projection. But I like that moment because we often have the image of Monroe that we get later when he was president. And when he was president, he was much more level-headed than he was when he was younger. And earlier at this point, he is quite extreme and quite radical and does fly off the handle. And you're right, they're children.
So my former student, Joanne Freeman, has written the greatest book on this, Affairs of Honor, which is a fabulous book. She's an incredible historian, and I know you know her. Most of these things settle out at some point, but if these are men of honor, and both of these two are, Hamilton and Monroe, if Hamilton says, "You besmirched me, I demand clarification," Monroe can say, "You're right, I shouldn't have done it, and I apologize." End of game. Monroe can say, "I don't know anything."
Sometimes they would also require like a public
little letter, a pamphlet, a letter to a third party, which is what Jefferson did in the John Walker affair. But if Hamilton comes to Monroe and says, "You besmirched me, I demand an explanation," and Monroe says, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, but I had nothing to do with it, Hamilton can't just let that go. As a man of honor, he now has to say, "Wait a minute, you as a man of honor, you should at least own the thing that you did, and then we can talk."
Yes.
But since Monroe didn't, and I think, frankly, if this had happened in 1797, I believe Monroe would have killed Hamilton, because Monroe, like all Virginians, was like a crack shot. And I think Burr is one thing, but I think if you fought Monroe, you're probably dead. At any rate, hilarious.
He was also very decorated. He had
been wounded.
He had been in the war for a long time. He had been an officer. He had been with Washington at
Valley
Trenton
Forge.
and Princeton and Valley Forge, and so he was the real deal.
He's not Jefferson. I mean, Jefferson's going to where's the trigger on this thing? Where do you pour the gunpowder? All right, so it's a great scene in your book. So, but now a really, really, really moving one, and one that even more is a moral reflection on us. Adams becomes president. His son, J.Q. Adams, John Quincy Adams, is an American minister in Europe. Adams doesn't know what to do. He doesn't ever want to be charged with nepotism. He writes a letter to George Washington saying, I'm not sure what to do about this. And Washington, in one of his most beautiful moments, says, "No, your son's the best qualified. You shouldn't worry about that. We need good diplomats. Clear your mind of this." I'm sure Adams saved that letter. So then John Quincy is trying to go to Lisbon and has already sent all of his stuff, his trunks and his paintings and his furniture and everything. He gets this letter from his father saying, "No, you're to go to Berlin." And it really, really upsets John Quincy, partly because he says, "Now I have to get all that luggage shipped to another. It's going to be enormously, I wish I had known." But even more than that, Lindsay, he says, "You are now opening me up to a loss of reputation, because now they're going to say that I'm a nepotist, that I didn't really earn it, that I don't have the merit." He said, "You should have consulted me." He writes to his mother and said, "If you two knew me, you would not have let this happen." And I love that. It was so moving, because today, think of Ivanka or think of Hunter. Just think of our world. His sense of that is so beautiful. Like, there are things in a small R republic, there are things way more important than the routine business of power.
Well, and in that case, I don't see that to me as some of this toxic honor. It was more of an understanding that he genuinely had to kind of make his own way in the world. They were not a super wealthy family, and he was trying to develop a career based on his own merit. And so he could not risk having that merit besmirched by any charges of nepotism, because it would make it harder for him to support himself. And so it was a real genuine recognition that his reputation was everything and would limit his success in the future, and he cared deeply. And I can just see he's so, when Abigail writes to him and sort of tries to guilt him into doing things, he's so insulted that she would feel that he would need to be guilted into service.
We've talked before about how his mother wrote that incredible letter saying, "Given the advantages of birth and training you've had, if you don't do something very remarkable with your life, it would be better that you had never been born." that this is a tense relationship, but I love this about John Quincy Adams because it's not about Hamiltonian honor or Monrovian honor. It's about what a republic means and what it means to earn your way in the world and not have it handed to you by circumstance. I love this about him. Anyway, so now I want to go to Pickering because he's the enemy of this book. I've always hated Pickering. I don't like Rufus King very much, but I loathe Timothy Pickering, and you nailed it. I'm just going to quote from your book here. So you try to be nice. You say Pickering had been serving as the Secretary of War after Henry Knox's departure and was perfectly adequate for that office, but he was wildly unsuited to the nation's top diplomatic position, i.e. Secretary of State. Pickering was always convinced he was the smartest person in the room, despite spending time with many of the greatest minds in American history. His intensity, now you try to defend him a little, his intensity can be partly attributed to his hardscrabble upbringing and his family's deep connection to its Puritan roots. Pickering's large family was always overworked and short on funds. Well, now that you've gotten that out of the way, you'd say this. As one historian said, however, perhaps it's unfair to the Puritans to blame them for Pickering's tyrannical personality. Wow. It's like, that's unfair to the Puritans. He's much worse than a Puritan. And then you say, Pickering could never be happy in heaven because he must there find and acknowledge a superior than God. Then you go on, as if you haven't said enough. Pickering had risen to the top position in the cabinet through sheer force of will, but brought little of the experience expected of a Secretary of State. He had never traveled out of the United States. He held no diplomatic positions. He spoke poor French, the language of 18th century diplomacy. Perhaps most important, he viewed compromise as a moral failing, and anyone who disagreed with him as an enemy to be crushed, a dangerous combination for any politician, let alone the top official charged with diplomacy. You must have, I'll bet you thought, did I go too far?
No, I had a lot of fun writing that one. Actually, that's not totally true. I did take out one line that I felt was perhaps excessive. Often in talks, I describe Pickering as someone who was best suited to live in and serve on the Spanish Inquisition. So I took that out, which I thought was very generous of me.
Very Savonarola of you. All right. So I love that because, I mean, you will agree that if you have to find someone in this period just to hate, I don't hate Burr. I don't even hate Hamilton. I mean, I find trouble with some people, but mostly I just want to understand, and I find them very, very interesting, fascinating, colorful, problematic, conflicted, complicated, like everybody else. But Pickering, I cannot find a single good thing to say. And just before you answer that, he did everything in his power to undermine the legitimacy and the presidency of John Adams. I mean, he worked tirelessly to undermine the sitting president of the United States.
Yes. The two good things I could say about him were he had a son who had, I think, like what we would call to be special needs, and he was apparently quite caring about his son. That obviously doesn't really make it into the book because his family was always away from him, so I didn't really include a whole lot of that. And the second is he was pretty instrumental in ensuring American trade with Haiti, and so was sort of instrumental in securing the first white recognition of a black republic. And so he does have a more modern sensibility when it comes to race than some of the other figures, but he's so intense and he's so partisan and ideological, and he works so hard to really try and kind of bring down the presidency, because if he wasn't going to be in control, he didn't want anyone to be, that it's really hard to see the good there.
The most interesting fun fact from your book is that Washington never included John Adams in a single cabinet meeting, not once. So today, you know, every president says, my vice president is going to be so important, they're going to have all these portfolios, I'm not going to belittle them. And then they usually do use them in some important ways. And the vice president does attend cabinet meetings and so on, unless he or she's out of town. George Washington is a very shrewd man, and he seems to have wanted Adams to be his successor, and yet he didn't do any of the work except one weird meeting that Adams was like, what the heck just happened? He kept it for, it was the only time Washington ever let himself be with Adams to talk about policy and the presidency.
Yeah, this is where I find Washington sometimes confusing and often inconsistent in his behavior. And I actually think that's a really good thing, because if Washington struggles with this, then it's obviously not an easy challenge. And so a lot of the things that he struggles with in his post-presidential life are issues that we still grapple a lot with today. And one of them is how involved a former president should be in this transition. And so, you know, Washington is so meticulous about setting up the first election and creating the first peaceful transfer of power. He's so so intentional about it. He is so thoughtful about it. He does it so carefully. He shows up. He's so respectful. And yet he does not tell Adams that some of his secretaries are terrible and, maybe you should replace them. And in fact, encourages said secretaries to stay in office. And I cannot for the life of me figure out why. I think maybe he thought it would provide some institutional stability and kind of preservation of some of his policies, and he didn't totally know what Adams wanted to do. But if he had talked to Adams, they were actually so in line with one another, especially on foreign policy. I think it would have been very reassuring. I don't know if he just didn't want to interfere. It wasn't really his style to tell other people how to do things in that way. And my best guess is that it's some combination of all those things. Plus, he just didn't really trust Adams' political judgment and thought that maybe, I think, the secretaries would sort of keep things on an even keel. That's my best guess.
And yet Adams' political judgment not only was good as president, but it dovetailed very nicely with Washington's own outlook, particularly on foreign affairs. But something that Washington did right after leaving the presidency just moved me to tears, frankly. I'll bet it did you too. Because as president, he could not call on people.
It was one of the precedents that he established, that he would not call on people because it would demonstrate favoritism, or it would, somehow be a problem. And so he decided not to.
And I think he was right, and he can't do private dinner parties and so on. This is all right out of Jane Austen, who calls first and who leaves the card and all that. But the custom is that the more important person waits for the less important person to call and then decides whether he or she will return that visit. So one of the most moving things in all of your book is that after he left the presidency, George Washington calls on John Adams as a private citizen. That means one thing really important, that Washington knew that he had relinquished power and that he couldn't just presume for the rest of his life to be the great George Washington.
In some ways, I think some of these things can sound silly, like calling custom,
they're not silly.
Blah, blah, blah. But they're so important, and they also, the symbolic value, you're talking about the importance of building things. The presidency is still so new, and the American people are struggling to know what to think about it. And the symbolic value of Washington saying, this thing is more important than me, is huge.
And one more thing before we take our second break. So Adams comes in to give his first inaugural address, and he takes the oath of office, and then he gives the address, and there's really serious applause. I mean, he feels like, hey, finally, the world gets it of how important I am. And just at that moment, Washington rolls through the door and the crowd goes wild, and they're cheering and weeping and crying and throwing things, and Adam's like, oh, okay, I get it. It's so cool that Washington, there's only one Washington, right?
No, there's only one Washington. The uniform way in which everyone present spoke about the historic nature of the 1797 transition and that inauguration, not knowing what was coming next, was so powerful to me to see in the archives, because it reflected their just deep sense that they were doing something historic. And it's a good reminder that we often don't know what is coming next in our lives, but we often do know when we're living through historic moments, and they did too.
I'm talking with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, our good friend, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. We need to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. I'm talking with Lindsay about her new spectacular book. I've just so loved reading it. Lindsay, I was out in the middle of nowhere. I was at Ekalaka, Montana, at this state park, and it's so isolated, and I was there, and I sat through reading it, and I cried, and I laughed, and I shook my fist at you from time to time, and I took extensive notes, and I just thought, how glorious to be able to read a book of someone that you really care about, and to know a little bit about how her mind works as you read it. And so congratulations. I urge everyone who's listening to get this book and read it, because it's not only a really good book about something that has not gotten a lot of attention, the actual presidential years of John Adams. You unearthed a lot of new material, or you've shown light on material that has not gotten the attention that it deserves previously. And I just want to go to a passage here, if I can find it, because this is where I think you're speaking to us. This is the first true election. Both sides endeavored to establish campaign etiquette. The states counted votes in earnest, and politicians struggled to protect the sanctity of elections from foreign interference. which threatened to undermine the system. Finally, the American people tried to determine how to elect a president other than Washington and started to learn how to cherish the norms and customs that bolstered democratic elections as the foundation of the republic. Of course, that's superb, but you are talking to us, aren't you?
I don't know. I guess I spent so much time in the 1790s, and it just, obviously there are things about it that feel so different. There's a passage where I describe presidential travel, and it's nothing like Air Force One. But there are things that sometimes just felt so exactly what we're living through. And I don't know, I came away with such a renewed sense of the importance of these institutions, and I wanted a little bit of that to come through for readers.
You patriot.
I know.
And remember, George Washington said that he felt like a felon being led to the gallows when he took the presidency, a ruffian of some sort. And here's Abigail, who I think you spent a lot of time on Abigail in this book. I was unaware that she had a terrible illness that nearly cost her life during Adams' presidency and had to stay back and so on. But Adams is famously kind of a self-pitying, self-whining, grumbly kind of guy. But here's what she said about following Washington. She couldn't help but wonder if Washington, quote, was reviled and abused, his administration perplexed, and his measures impeded. Then, what's the expected lot of his successors? If they treated the great Washington this way, how would they treat any successor? She feared the second president would be, quote, fastened up hand and foot and tongue to be shot at as our Quincy lads do at the poor geese and turkeys. Wow.
She really does write a very colorful phrase.
What a thing to say, that your husband's going to be strung up by his feet like Mussolini, and the Republicans, the Jacobins, the enemy, the Jeffersonians, are going to be shooting at him, taking pot shots at him through his whole presidency, which is in fact what happened.
Yes. And I'm glad you picked an early phrase in the book, because she was just such a savvy political observer of men and politics and the United States, but she just so accurately often saw what was coming down the pike and could interpret who was behind it and what was going to happen. And so her interpretations are almost always spot on.
Yeah, I really love that in the book. And also, there's a time when Adams is sending us, the other peace delegation to France, and Pickering and the cabinet are going nuts, and they're whining to Hamilton and whining to Washington. And then one of them says, maybe it's Sedgwick, God, I wish Abigail were in town because she can control this guy. If Abigail were here, she'd know how to, she would be a much better judge of the situation. She would handle it so much more maturely than her husband. I had always thought that, I always say, when I'm talking about it, she was the better half, or they were co-presidents, but this solidifies it, that people thought she was an important steadying influence on her husband.
Well, they did when it suited them. When they thought she would agree with them, or when she did agree with them, then they really liked her interference and her influence. And that particular moment I find so funny, because base Federalists in both Philadelphia and Massachusetts were saying the same thing. And so both she heard this and John heard it, and then they were writing back and forth about it, and they both found it very funny, because she said, oh, this is really quite saucy, because
right, saucy, her favorite word.
Yeah, because first of all, she was like, I consider it to be a masterstroke. So she agreed with him and would not have disagreed with his choices. But he found it funny too. Like, he was not offended that people thought that she controlled him, which I think shows some bigness of spirit. But when she did not agree with them, and when she was not helpful, then they accused her of being a politicking French woman.
Untrue and unfair also. Making the presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that forged the Republic. So I want to go to Jefferson for a moment, and not to pick on you at all. That comes later. The Mazzei letter. So Philip Mazzei is an Italian vigneron and kind of a busybody, a small R Republican, friend to Jefferson, a friend to the American left, let's put it. Jefferson had written a letter in which he said that Solomon's in the field and Samson's in the court had had their hair shorn by the harlot England, published without Jefferson's permission. And a few things in Jefferson's life did more damage to him than this letter. And Gouverneur Morris said, the morals of the writer of the Mazzei letter cannot be pure. Like, if you're saying George Washington is like Samson or Solomon, and that England has perverted them or has taken their integrity, that you cannot be respected. And you talk a lot about this incident. How deep was the wound, how deep was the setback for Jefferson when that letter was published?
It is a really important moment, not so much, I think, because it affected, Jefferson and Washington's relationship, although it certainly did. At this point, they were already sort of on the outs anyway. But why I think it matters is because it really poisoned the well in Philadelphia. It made it impossible for Adams to pursue bipartisanship. It made it impossible for him to consider working with Jefferson. It made it impossible for him to sort of reach out to the Democratic Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans, and it calcified the existing partisan divides and the partisan rhetoric that was already being used by those forces. And so it made the political scene around Adams and Jefferson much more difficult, in addition to affecting Jefferson's personal relationship. But that's really where I see the big difference. Is it was one of those moments that changed the dynamic in Philadelphia in a way that was impossible to retrace.
And it goes back to your larger theme of precedents. So John Adams is the next president, and someone who's essentially already known as, in the opposition world, is his VP because of the quirk of the Electoral College then. And for a short time, Jefferson and Adams kind of circle each other, thinking maybe we can cooperate, maybe this is a bipartisan, maybe the presidency is above politics in some important way. And they both are kind of urging, maybe this is good, maybe we're old friends, they deeply respect each other. And then their partisans on both sides say, nope, we're not doing that, including Madison, who says, don't do it, do it, you'll regret it, you're going to have to break with him. So, but my point is that the precedent of how you handle those had not been set yet. And just about the time when it was reaching sort of its end game, the Mazzei letter is published, and now it just blows everything up, and that's it. Now it's, no, Jefferson's the enemy.
Yeah, it really closes the door on a lot of possibilities about what could have been for the vice president, what could have been for Adams and Jefferson, and what could have been in this new regime in which it had not yet been figured out.
First of all, let me say that Jefferson, as usual, handled this terribly. It is unfair that the letter was published. I think that was a breach of decorum and good sense by Mazzei. But Jefferson then, of course, does the usual thing. He says, he says to Washington and Adams, don't you agree that this is a fundamental violation of the privacy of communication? And he's wanting them to agree with him that the breach is unprofessional and unacceptable. And then he says, and I no more meant George Washington than I meant the man in the moon. I mean, no. And everyone knows he's lying. Everyone knows he's lying, and Jefferson, too, knows he's lying. And he does this a number of times in his career where he's caught red-handed in a nakedly political and partisan moment, and instead of just saying, yup, I regret it, these things happen, he lies, and that makes it worse.
Oh, it totally makes it worse, because certainly there were a lot of people who said things that they later regretted or, were rash in moments of passion. Adams and Hamilton were certainly those types of people. Washington was a little bit better about keeping things under control, but he generally actually accepted apologies. And so it's one of those things where if he had, acknowledged it and not tried to make it a thing where he was not at fault, it would have gone over a long way with some of the people that he was, in theory, still trying to work with and who wanted to work with him if he had given them an out.
Let me ask you this question. Jefferson always says he doesn't really want to be president. He wants to be gardening and doing man of letters, and he has things to take care of. His beloved Monticello, where he rides above the storms. He mostly means it, I think. Adams said, oh, come on, he's honeycombed with ambition. Don't buy the Cincinnati talk from Jefferson. But I think I'm willing to believe Jefferson mostly means it. And compared to someone like Bill Clinton, for example, who said, I wanted to be president since he was 16, that's all he ever thought about until he screwed it up. How much do you take Jefferson at his word that he didn't really necessarily want to be president?
I don't think he wanted to be president until 1800. I think during the election of 1800, he really wanted to be president.
But for the best reason, because he thought the country could not survive without a shift.
Yes, but I think that I think that he both believed that the country needed to be led by a Jeffersonian Republican and also believed he was the only one that could do it. He may not have been wrong, but that is, in other words, also a unique form of ego and ambition, which is not a bad thing. Presidents do have to have a certain level of ego to believe that they are the person that needs to be in this office and they are the person that needs to make these impossible decisions. Put another way, they have to be a little bit nuts to want to take on this job. But that doesn't mean they're wrong or bad. It just means that they have to have this conviction. And I think Up until that point, he didn't really have that conviction. He might not have always agreed with Washington, but he thought Washington was still fairly trustworthy. In 1797, he didn't always agree with Adams, but he still thought he was fairly trustworthy. In 1800, he thought that he had to be the person to do it. And I think at that point, he'd kind of come around to wanting it.
But remember, he kept telling Madison, you do it, you do it, you do it, you do it. I mean, you're the guy, you're the more partisan, but Madison's like, no way, no one's electing me. Maybe after you. But, I mean, I think there's something to that, too. I think Jefferson rightly understood that if there were one opposition member in the country who could maybe win the election of 1800, it was he, Thomas Jefferson, and that nobody else was likely to be able to win. So let me ask a second question. My view is that it's absolutely essential that Jefferson won the election of 1800 because he turned the country in a slightly different direction. He was more moderate than he said he would be, but he was. He wasn't something new under the sun. He brought down the ceremonials. He tried to create a kind of a first citizen approach to the presidency. How important do you think it is that the Federalist era was checked in 1800?
So I would argue that the things that you associate most with the Federalist era was actually checked in 1799. The worst impulses of the Federalist era had already been mostly defeated by Adams undermining the army, which had become very political, and pursuing diplomacy and making sure there wasn't war with France, and thus the army was going to be disbanded. And the worst legislation was going to expire at the end of his first term either way. And so while certainly the country would have looked different if Adams had won, I don't think it would have been an extreme Federalist administration. So I think I would offer a slightly different hypothetical in that way.
I do think that Adams was more independent than he was partisan as a Federalist, and that his courage in 1798 and 1799 is breathtaking. It is one of the greatest acts of statesmanship in American history that he knew, he's surrounded by enemies who are undermining him in every possible way and being dishonest about it too. And he knows they're dishonest, and they know he knows they're dishonest. And I can't understand the war fever. So we don't have a lot of time, but explain why the high feds so wanted war.
Well, I think there were a couple of reasons. It was very good for them politically because as long as there was the threat of war, then the Republicans looked bad because they had been so pro-French. It was good for them in terms of their political agenda because they wanted to have a strong army. They wanted to have a strong navy. These were things that they wanted to invest in anyway and sort of build up the institutions of executive power. So the idea of taxation and a strong army and those things were things they wanted. And so the war was an excuse to do them. But the army was a great spoils system. It was like the first spoils system for politics because it allowed them to appoint all of these Federalists as officers. And so it built up political connections and networks in a way that they were very much behind the Republicans in doing. And so the army was sort of an umbrella under which they could do so. And so when Adams took those things away and it became very clear that diplomacy might happen and officers were returning their commissions in droves and soldiers were deserting and they were just despondent because this thing that they thought would help them to electoral success was gone.
So, Lindsay, we just have a minute or two left, so I want to do a couple more programs, and I hope you will admit to the world that I have not attacked you for 1 second.
You have been gloriously
generous.
I look forward to the second program in which you tell me all the things I get wrong.
No, I don't think you got anything wrong. I do, but I want to ask you to clarify certain of the wilder things you said about Mr. Jefferson in the second program. But for now, you note that the first two presidents, George Washington and John Adams, each made a colossal mistake. Washington more than Adams, so I'll come back to that. Adams leaves town for 8 full months at the most critical moment of his political destiny, goes back to Quincy. Everyone around him is like, has he abdicated? Is he even still president? I mean, what's going on? We can't communicate. I mean, he should be here. What the hell's going on with this guy? What was going on with him?
Hard to say. I think it is a combination of multiple things. One, Abigail was extremely sick, and he did not want to leave her side. 2, he was annoyed with all of his cabinet and didn't want anything to do with them, with the exception of the Secretary of the Navy, who he adored. 3, his distance was in some ways useful because it did allow him to slow play the buildup of the army. He used the slowness of the mail to great advantage.
Let's close with the bigger one, because that was a policy thing and it all worked out. George Washington, semi-reluctantly, playing Cincinnatus, agrees to be the commander in the field of an army should we have to fight France in America. He asks for the discretion to name his own officer corps. Adams knows that that can't be okay because we have civilian control of the military, and the president is the president, and a former president should not have that kind of authority. And the person that Washington was going to choose was none other than Alexander Hamilton. And I think it's fair to say that Adams distrusted and loathed Alexander Hamilton. So Washington, when he hears that Adams is going to do technically the right thing by using seniority as he named the people that would work with Washington, which is how it should have been under Army protocols, Washington throws one of the worst hissy fits of his life and says, "Nope. If I don't get to choose Hamilton, I ain't coming. You can go ahead, take the political hit. Go ahead, try that." I'm paraphrasing, of course. And I think that is a grave constitutional misstep. He allowed his pride, he allowed his sense of his greatness to get in the way of the constitutional process. And if it had held, and you say this, if this precedent had held, that the militarists, the generals in the army, get to, in a sense, veto presidential policy, that would have been disastrous for the American Republic.
Yeah, it would have. It would have really undermined civilian control of the military. It would have made the army much more political. It would have jeopardized executive power, and it was something that Washington would have never permitted when he was in office. And I think in some ways it was very much in some ways the cabinet's fault, because they kind of maneuvered him, and Hamilton maneuvered him into it, but he let himself be maneuvered into that. And I think it's one of the worst decisions he made in his long career, of which he made many good decisions. I think he got really lucky that two things happened. He got really lucky that Adams pursued diplomacy and the army was reduced in power and reduced in its political deadliness. And he kind of got lucky when he died, because he underwent an apotheosis and he no longer became a living political figure that other presidents had to grapple with. And so I think those two things really ensured that mistake didn't tarnish too much his legacy.
Just to close, when Adams sent the next peace mission off, Washington wrote to congratulate him and said, yes, this is the right thing to do. He didn't say, hey, I wanted that war. I wanted Hamilton to have his war. He said, no, you've done the right thing. And I think that shows the greatness of George Washington.
Yes, I think he did ultimately want peace. He didn't want war. He didn't want to be involved with the army anymore. And so when he recognized that Adams was pursuing a policy that he too supported, he was big enough to say so.
Making the presidency, John Adams and the precedents that forged the Republic. Lindsay, deep felt congratulations. I have loved your book. We're going to talk further about it. I hope that it rocks the historical world. I look forward to the next time. I haven't even put a glove on you. I'm sure you'll bob and weave anyway, as you always do, but we'll see you all next week for another important episode of Listening to America.